The night in downtown Nashville was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Streetlights glowed along West End Avenue, their yellow pools of light stretching across the pavement. The air was still, the kind of silence that made every small sound echo, the distant hum of a late-night bus, the rustle of a breeze against a row of boutique storefronts. Lieutenant Karen Dobbs sat in her patrol car at the corner, her fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel. She told herself she was just keeping watch, maintaining order, but deep down she knew she was restless. Nights like this made her itch for something to happen. She scanned the sidewalks, her eyes trained the way years of patrol work had taught her. Nothing unusual, a few cars parked neatly, the occasional flicker of a neon sign still buzzing above a diner. Then she saw him. A man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Black. He wore a dark tailored suit that fit him too perfectly to be casual, polished shoes clicking lightly against the pavement. He didn't slouch, didn't rush. His stride was steady, deliberate, as though the night belonged to him and he had no reason to hurry. Karen's attention locked on him immediately. Something about the way he moved irritated her. Confidence. Self-assuredness. The kind of composure that told her he wasn't afraid of anything, least of all her. She didn't like that. Not one bit. She flicked on her headlights, flooding the street in sudden brightness. The man didn't falter. He didn't even look startled. That only sharpened the edge of annoyance curling in her chest. Karen eased the patrol car forward, rolling up beside him. "You live around here?" she called out, leaning slightly out of the window. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The man turned his head, calm, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" His tone was even, almost polite. Not defensive. Not submissive. Just calm. Karen felt her jaw tighten. "It's a simple question," she pressed. The silence between them stretched, and she decided to escalate. She opened the door and stepped out of her cruiser, boots striking the pavement with weight. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," she added, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't true, but it was the kind of line she'd used plenty of times before. The man exhaled, slow, controlled. "I'd like to know what description that is." "Tall. Dark suit. Walking in an area that's had recent break-ins." Karen squared her shoulders, asserting presence. He studied her for a moment, eyes steady. No fear. Only a flicker of disbelief, maybe even irritation. "I see. Well, I'd be happy to clarify anything, but do you have probable cause to detain me?" The way he spoke, measured, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly how these things worked, gnawed at her. He wasn't fumbling or making excuses. He wasn't intimidated. "Let's see some ID," she ordered. For a second, he hesitated, not out of guilt but out of recognition. He already knew where this was headed. And he was right. Before his hand reached his pocket, Karen stepped forward, voice sharp. "Hands where I can see them." The man sighed, patience thinning. "Officer, this is unnecessary. Turn around." His shoulders stiffened, but he complied, slow, deliberate, like a man who'd been through this too many times before. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Karen exhaled. Just like that, it was done. But something about his silence, his lack of resistance, unsettled her. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. It was as though he already knew this was only the beginning. The ride to the precinct should have been routine. Karen had cuffed countless people in her career, and most reacted the same way: anger, excuses, protests of innocence. But this man was different. He sat in the back of the cruiser with an unnerving stillness, his eyes fixed on the passing city lights as though he wasn't the one in custody. Not a word left his lips, not a single plea or outburst. The silence pressed against Karen harder than any shouting ever had. She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the steady gaze. He didn't fit the profile of the people she usually hauled in at night. Still, she told herself, appearances meant nothing. Crime had no uniform. And yet, deep down, she knew she hadn't seen him commit a single suspicious act. All she had was a feeling, that restless itch in her chest that demanded she act. By the time they reached the precinct, the unease had settled into her gut. She handed him off to the booking officers with clipped instructions. Name, ID, run him through the system. Charge him with obstruction and resisting. The officers gave her a look. He didn't look like someone who had resisted, but no one challenged her. They never did. Not Karen Dobbs, who had been with the department for years and carried herself like she owned the room. Her word carried weight, and tonight she used it without hesitation. But the man still wasn't reacting the way she expected. As they processed him, he complied with every instruction. Fingerprints, photo, paperwork, he did it all with a calm detachment, like he had rehearsed this scene before and was just waiting for the curtain to rise. That composure gnawed at her nerves. She wanted him to lash out, to shout about injustice, to give her something that justified the decision she had already made. But he didn't. His silence accused her louder than words ever could. Later, as she typed up the incident report, she found herself justifying her language more than usual. Suspicious behavior. Loitering near closed businesses. Refusal to provide identification. The words looked solid on paper, but even as she wrote them, a sliver of doubt cut through her certainty. Had he truly refused? Or had she not given him the chance before barking commands? Karen shoved the thought aside. She was an officer. She knew what suspicious looked like. She knew when someone didn't belong. And yet, when she thought of the way he looked at her, steady, unimpressed, as though he already knew how this would play out, it unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. This wasn't over. Not for him. And, though she didn't know it yet, not for her either. Morning came, but the unease of the night before followed Karen into the courthouse. She told herself it was just another arrest, another open and shut case. Yet when she replayed the moment in her head, the man's silence, his calm eyes meeting hers, something inside her twisted. She shook it off. Courtrooms were about procedure, not feelings. The Davidson County Courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm. Lawyers hurried between benches with files clutched under their arms. A judge's gavel cracked in a nearby chamber, drawing murmurs of all rise. For Karen, this was familiar ground. She had testified dozens of times before. Most cases ended the same way, her word against theirs, and the badge on her chest always tipped the scales. She adjusted her uniform in the hallway mirror before entering. Shoulders square, chin high. She wasn't about to let one smooth-talking suspect rattle her. Inside the courtroom, she spotted him immediately. Terrence Lawson. He sat at the defense table, not slouched or anxious, but upright and composed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. That calmness again. Not a man fighting for survival, but a man waiting for something. Karen bristled. Defendants usually avoided eye contact. Lawson didn't. His eyes met hers across the room, steady, unreadable, and it unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. The bailiff called the session to order. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, scanned the room before nodding for proceedings to begin. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit, rose first. His tone was professional, controlled. Lieutenant Dobbs, please walk us through the night of the arrest. Karen cleared her throat, forcing the doubt from her mind. I was on patrol around 10:30 p.m. along West End Avenue. I noticed the defendant behaving suspiciously near several businesses that had recently reported break-ins. And what behavior led you to approach him? He was loitering near storefronts, taking his time, surveying the area. His conduct suggested he was possibly casing businesses. The prosecutor nodded approvingly, as if this were routine. Karen's confidence swelled. Yes, she thought, this would go the way it always did. And when you approached him? I asked for identification. He refused to provide it. At that point, I had no choice but to detain him. From the defense table, Lawson didn't flinch. No reaction, no objection. He just sat there, hands still folded, gaze fixed. Karen forced herself to look away. The judge's eyes flicked toward the defense attorney. "Ms. Hayes, your witness." Karen exhaled, bracing herself. She had handled cross-examinations before. But when Victoria Hayes stood, sharp suit, sharper gaze, Karen felt the first pinprick of doubt return. This wasn't going to be routine. Not today. The hum of voices in the Davidson County Courthouse was steady, like the low thrum of a hive. Attorneys shuffled papers, clerks whispered updates, and the scrape of chairs against the polished floor echoed under the high ceilings. Karen had walked into this building dozens of times before, but today the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves were listening. She straightened her uniform jacket and kept her chin high. This wasn't her first testimony, and she knew the drill. Stick to the facts, project authority, don't let the defense twist her words. It was the same script every time. But when she glanced across the room at the defense table, her composure faltered. Terrence Lawson sat there with an ease that didn't belong in a courtroom. Most defendants fidgeted, their eyes darting nervously between the judge and jury. Not Lawson. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded neatly in front of him, posture steady. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't intimidated. He looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That bothered her more than she cared to admit. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge entered, her black robe swishing lightly as she ascended the bench. Judge Margaret Ellison wasn't one to waste words. She gave a curt nod before taking her seat, her sharp eyes already sweeping the room. "You may be seated." Karen lowered herself into the witness chair, her palms pressed flat against her thighs to keep them still. She had faced Judge Ellison before. The woman was fair but strict, and she didn't suffer weak testimony. The prosecutor, Robert Mills, adjusted his glasses and rose. A man of routine, Robert never strayed far from the safe questions. That was why Karen liked working with him. Predictable, reliable. "Lieutenant Dobbs," he began, pacing slowly toward her. "Please walk us through the events of the evening in question." Karen let out a steadying breath. "At approximately 10:30 p.m., I was on routine patrol along West End Avenue. I observed the defendant lingering near several closed businesses. Given that the area has had recent break-ins, I approached him for questioning." Robert nodded. "And what happened then?" "I asked for identification. The defendant refused. At that point, I detained him and transported him to the precinct for processing." Her words came smoothly, rehearsed almost. She watched Robert jot something down before he looked up again. "Did the defendant resist in any way?" Karen hesitated for the briefest second. "He was uncooperative, yes. But the arrest was made without incident." Across the room, Lawson's attorney, Victoria Hayes, adjusted her glasses. There was the faintest smile at the corner of her lips, not mockery, but anticipation. She already knew where she was going with this, and Karen suddenly felt a flicker of unease she hadn't expected. Robert returned to his table. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge's gaze shifted to the defense. "Ms. Hayes?" Victoria stood, smoothing the lapel of her blazer, and took a deliberate step forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached the witness stand. Karen sat a little straighter, masking the knot of tension forming in her chest. Something told her this was about to get complicated. The courtroom had settled into that heavy silence unique to cross-examinations, the kind where every cough, every shuffle of paper seemed too loud. Karen sat in the witness chair, her back stiff, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had given her account, the same polished version she had written into her report. For a moment, she almost believed it herself. Victoria Hayes rose with calm confidence, her glasses glinting under the courtroom lights. She carried a thin folder in one hand, but it wasn't the papers that unsettled Karen, it was the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who had dismantled dozens of officers on the stand before. Lieutenant Dobbs, Victoria began smoothly, you testify that Mr. Lawson was loitering near several closed businesses, correct? Yes, Karen said firmly. And that his behavior raised your suspicions? Yes. Victoria tilted her head. Let's talk about that suspicion. Did you witness Mr. Lawson attempting to open a door or window that night? Karen paused, heat prickling at the back of her neck. No. Did he run when you approached him? Hide? Exhibit any behavior consistent with someone preparing to commit a crime? Karen forced her tone steady. Not exactly. Not exactly, Victoria repeated slowly, letting the words linger in the air. She took a step closer. So, Lieutenant, aside from simply walking down the street, what exactly made him suspicious? Karen clenched her jaw. His conduct. He was surveying the area. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Surveying? Or simply, walking? The question hung there, deceptively simple. A few jurors exchanged glances. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Victoria pressed on. Lieutenant, are you aware of the Fourth Amendment? Karen bristled. Of course. Then you know that an officer needs reasonable suspicion to detain someone. So I'll ask again, what specific criminal activity did you observe that justified stopping Mr. Lawson? Karen's mouth felt dry. She searched for the right words, but all that came out was, he refused to show identification. Ah, Victoria said, flipping through her folder. But refusing to produce ID, by itself, is not a crime. Isn't that correct? Karen gripped the armrest of the chair. It can be, if the individual is suspected of unlawful activity. Unlawful activity that you didn't witness. Victoria's tone sharpened. Lieutenant, did you stop anyone else on West End Avenue that night? Karen blinked. No. Were there other pedestrians? Yes. But only Mr. Lawson was detained? Yes. Victoria let the silence stretch before delivering her final blow. Would you have done the same if you were white? The question landed like a crack of thunder. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. The judge's gavel struck once. Order. Karen swallowed hard, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Race had nothing to do with it. Victoria's lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile, as if she had expected that answer all along. She turned toward the jury, then back to the judge. No further questions, for now. Karen sat frozen in the witness chair, but she could feel the balance of the courtroom shift against her. And for the first time, she realized her badge might not protect her this time. The sharp rap of Judge Ellison's gavel restored order, but the tension in the room was far from settled. Karen's heart pounded like a drumline in her chest. She had been cross-examined before, countless times, but never like this. Victoria Hayes wasn't just asking questions, she was peeling away her authority, layer by layer, until only raw nerves remained. Victoria didn't sit down right away. Instead, she lingered near the jury box, her eyes still locked on Karen. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, I request permission to recall Lieutenant Dobbs later for further questioning. Judge Ellison adjusted her glasses. Granted. The defense attorney gave a slight nod and finally returned to her table. Terrence Lawson leaned forward, whispering something in her ear. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes held a quiet confidence, as though the truth had always been on his side. Karen forced her breathing to steady as she stepped down from the witness stand. Each footstep echoed too loudly, and she felt every eye in the room following her. She returned to the prosecution's table, where Robert Mills gave her a reassuring glance, but even he seemed unsettled. Don't let her rattle you, Robert whispered. You did fine. Fine. The word tasted hollow. The prosecution called the next witness, Officer Ramirez, who had been on shift the same night. He confirmed the radio chatter, the arrest report, the chain of custody. Everything lined up on paper. But Karen noticed the way Victoria sat, perfectly still, pen tapping lightly against her notepad. She wasn't taking notes. She was waiting. When Ramirez stepped down, Victoria stood again. The defense calls Mr. Terrence Lawson. A quiet stir spread across the courtroom as Lawson rose and walked to the stand. His movements were deliberate, steady, as if every step was a reminder that he belonged there just as much as anyone else. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and took his seat. Victoria approached him gently, her voice shifting from sharp to almost protective. "Mr. Lawson, can you tell the court where you were headed the night of May 12th? "Yes," Lawson said, his voice deep but composed. "I was walking home. I'd just finished a late shift at Vanderbilt Hospital. I'm a surgical nurse." Karen's stomach dropped. She hadn't known that detail, or maybe she hadn't bothered to ask. Victoria nodded. "And when Lieutenant Dobbs approached you, what did you feel?" Lawson looked toward the jury, his gaze steady. "I felt like a criminal before I'd even spoken. Like my skin was the only reason I was being stopped." The words were quiet, but they carried like thunder across the courtroom. Karen clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to object, to shout that it wasn't true, but she wasn't the one holding the reins anymore. Victoria let the silence breathe before continuing. "Did you commit any crime that night, Mr. Lawson?" "No." "Did you resist arrest?" "No." "I only asked, why are you stopping me?" That was enough to put me in handcuffs." The jury's faces shifted, some frowning, some tightening their lips, others leaning forward with new interest. Karen looked at Judge Ellison, but the judge's expression was unreadable. For the first time in her career, Karen felt not like the enforcer of law, but the accused hiding behind it. The courtroom was hushed, as though every person inside had leaned forward and held their breath at once. Terrence Lawson sat upright in the witness chair, his hands folded neatly, his voice calm yet carrying a gravity that pressed against the walls. Victoria Hayes took a step closer, but her expression was softer now, as though she understood the burden Lawson carried. "Mr. Lawson," she said gently, "you've told us you were walking home from work that night. Can you share with the jury what that walk usually means to you?" Lawson drew in a slow breath. "It's peace. After 12 hours in an operating room, after fighting to keep patients alive, that walk is my exhale. I put in earbuds, breathe the night air, and remind myself I've done something good. That night should have been no different." The jury shifted, their attention fixed on him. "But instead?" Victoria prompted. Lawson's jaw tightened. "Instead, I saw flashing lights in my face. I heard orders barked at me like I was a suspect. And before I could even explain who I was, my wrists were in metal." He looked down briefly, then back at the jury. "Do you know what it feels like, after saving lives all day, to be treated like yours doesn't matter?" The words hung heavy. A woman in the jury box blinked rapidly, brushing away a tear. Victoria let the moment sink in, then asked, "Did Lieutenant Dobbs ever ask you where you were coming from? Where you worked? Anything about your life?" "No," Lawson said, voice steady but sharp. She didn't care. To her, I was already guilty. Not for what I did, but for what I looked like. Karen shifted in her seat, heat crawling up her neck. She wanted to interject, to object, but Robert Mills put a warning hand on her arm. This was dangerous ground. Victoria paced slowly. "Mr. Lawson, what happened after you were taken in?" "I was booked, fingerprinted, sat in a holding cell for 6 hours." His voice grew tighter. "And while I sat there, my patients, people who needed me, were waiting at that hospital. I missed rounds. I let down my team. All because an officer decided my skin was suspicious." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Victoria leaned in, lowering her tone. "How has that night changed the way you see your city? Your community? The people sworn to protect you?" Lawson's eyes flickered briefly toward Karen before returning to the jury. "I used to believe the badge meant protection. That officers were guardians. Now I cross the street when I see one coming. Because protection, it seems, doesn't extend to people who look like me." His words landed like a stone in still water, spreading outward, impossible to ignore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the jury's shifting sympathies. Full of the prosecution's growing unease. Full of Karen's pounding heart, trapped in her chest. Judge Ellison finally cleared her throat. The court will take a recess. But as the gavel struck, Karen knew the momentum of the trial had shifted, and it wasn't in her favor. Karen sat frozen at the prosecution's table, staring at the wood grain as the gavel's echo faded. The courtroom emptied in a low hum of footsteps and whispers, but the sound pressed on her like a swarm. She didn't move. Couldn't. Robert Mills gathered his files, leaning toward her. Don't let this shake you. Lawson's testimony was emotional, yes, but we'll get the jury back with hard evidence. Stay focused. Karen forced herself to nod, but her throat felt tight. Hard evidence. The phrase rang hollow. What was hard evidence compared to the look in Lawson's eyes when he spoke about betrayal? Compared to the way the jury hung on his every word? She pushed back her chair and stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The courthouse corridors smelled faintly of old coffee and polished marble. She kept her steps quick, heels clicking against the floor, desperate to outrun the unease clawing up her spine. Inside the women's restroom, she splashed cold water onto her face. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. She looked tired. Not the sharp, commanding officer who had stood tall in every briefing room for years. Her eyes were rimmed red, her posture slightly slumped, as if Lawson's words had seeped inside and cracked something she didn't know could break. Get it together, she whispered to her reflection, gripping the edge of the sink. You didn't do anything wrong. You followed protocol. You. But the voice inside her cut sharper. Protocol? Or prejudice? Karen's stomach lurched. She shoved the thought away, but it clawed back, louder now. Why didn't you ask him where he was going? Why didn't you see the hospital badge hanging from his neck? Why was his skin the first thing you noticed? She slammed the faucet off, grabbed a paper towel, and pressed it hard against her face. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not when the defense was circling like wolves, waiting for her to bleed. The restroom door creaked open, and Robert poked his head in. You all right? Karen straightened instantly, mask snapping back into place. I'm fine. He gave her a look, the kind that said he didn't believe her, but nodded anyway. We're back in 20 minutes. Pull yourself together. The jury needs to see confidence, not cracks. When he left, Karen exhaled shakily. Confidence. The word felt foreign now, like armor that no longer fit. She wasn't sure if she could wear it again. As she walked back toward the courtroom, her badge clipped to her belt caught the overhead light. Once, it had been her shield, her pride. But now it looked like a weight, a reminder that the same symbol Lawson once believed in had become his nightmare. And for the first time, Karen wondered if the badge she carried wasn't protecting justice at all, but protecting her from facing the truth. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the recess ended. The jurors filed back into their seats, some exchanging quiet glances, their faces still marked by the weight of Terrence Lawson's testimony. Karen sat stiffly beside Robert Mills, her hands clenched beneath the table where no one could see the faint tremor in her fingers. Judge Ellison adjusted her glasses and gave a curt nod. Miss Hayes, you may call your next witness. Victoria Hayes stood with calm precision, a quiet confidence radiating from her every movement. The defense calls Marcus Green to the stand. Karen's head snapped up. Marcus Green? The name struck like a hammer. She remembered him. A man she'd pulled over a year ago, in what she called at the time a routine stop. But her gut twisted now, because she remembered the fury in his eyes, the way his complaint had been brushed aside with a few lines of paperwork. Marcus, a tall man with steady shoulders and eyes that carried storms, walked to the stand. He was sworn in, then settled into the chair, gaze sweeping over the courtroom before locking briefly on Karen. The recognition there was unmistakable and damning. Victoria approached. "Mr. Green, can you tell the court about your encounter with Lieutenant Dobbs?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice even but heavy with memory. "It was about 11 months ago. I was driving home from work, same route I always take. Lieutenant Dobbs pulled me over. No broken taillight, no speeding. Just me, in my car, heading home." A ripple moved through the jury. Victoria nodded gently. "And what happened next?" "She came up to my window with her hand already on her weapon," Marcus said. "Didn't ask for my license first. Didn't explain why I was stopped. Just told me to keep my hands where she could see them. I did exactly what she said, but I could see it in her eyes." His jaw clenched. "Fear. Suspicion. Like I was a threat before I even opened my mouth." Karen shifted, heat flooding her cheeks. Robert scribbled furiously on his notepad, preparing objections, but the damage was already unraveling. "Did Lieutenant Dobbs explain why you've been stopped?" Victoria asked. "No," Marcus said flatly. "After 10 minutes of questions that had nothing to do with driving, she let me go. No ticket. No warning. Nothing. Just humiliation." A low murmur swept the gallery. Victoria turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern. Lieutenant Dobbs didn't see a surgeon walking home that night, she saw a threat. Just as she saw Mr. Green as a threat before he even spoke. This is not policing. This is prejudice wearing a badge." Robert shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, inflammatory." "Overruled," Judge Ellison said firmly. The jurors' faces told the story. Lawson's words had softened their hearts, but Marcus Green's testimony was cementing doubt in their minds. Doubt about Karen's judgment. Doubt about her integrity. Karen sat frozen, every muscle tense. She could feel the trial slipping further out of her grasp, the foundation she had built her career on crumbling under the weight of voices she had once ignored. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control of the story. She was the story, and it was unraveling fast. The courtroom air was heavier than steel. Every word, every breath seemed amplified under the fluorescent lights. Karen sat at the prosecution's table, her back straight, but inside she felt hollow. Marcus Green's testimony lingered like smoke in the jurors' minds, and Terrence Lawson's words still echoed like a hymn of betrayal. Judge Ellison's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard testimony from both sides. You will now consider the credibility of the evidence presented. Closing arguments begin." Robert Mills rose first, tugging his suit jacket into place. His tone was firm, but Karen noticed the slight rasp, even he felt the pressure. "Lieutenant Karen Dobbs is not a villain," he began, pacing before the jury. "She is a decorated officer who has risked her life countless times to protect this community. Yes, she made a judgment call that night. But judgment calls are what officers make in the field, every day, in split seconds. That does not make her racist. That does not make her corrupt. It makes her human." He paused, locking eyes with the jurors. If every mistake is painted as prejudice, then the very people sworn to protect us will be too afraid to act. And when hesitation replaces action, who suffers? We all do. Karen swallowed hard. It was the best he could do, but she sensed the words weren't enough. The jury didn't want logic. They wanted truth. Then Victoria Hayes stood. Her stride was slower, deliberate, like she was guiding the jury into a space they already knew existed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice low but steady, "this case isn't about one decision on one night. It's about a pattern. You heard Mr. Lawson's voice, filled with pain and betrayal. You heard Mr. Green's story, one of many ignored complaints. You saw the look in Lieutenant Dobbs's own eyes when those truths were spoken." She turned toward Karen, just briefly, before facing the jury again. "A badge is a symbol of trust. When that trust is broken, the community pays the price. Mr. Lawson paid that price when his dignity was stripped away on the very street he calls home. How many others must carry that weight before we say enough? Her voice sharpened. This trial isn't about punishing one woman. It's about holding an institution accountable through the actions of its representatives. If bias is allowed to hide behind procedure, then justice becomes just another uniform, empty and cold. The silence that followed was deafening. The jurors stared at Karen, some with pity, some with disappointment, some with something colder. Karen felt her throat tighten. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about winning or losing. She wasn't thinking about her badge, or her career, or her reputation. She was thinking about Lawson's face, the betrayal in his eyes, and Marcus Green's voice trembling with restrained anger. When the judge dismissed the jury for deliberation, Karen closed her eyes. She had faced violent criminals, armed standoffs, and nights where survival was uncertain, but never had she felt fear like this. Because this time, the enemy wasn't out there. It was inside her, carved deep into choices she'd made without ever questioning why. And now, for the first time, it was out in the open, waiting for 12 strangers to decide what it meant. The jury room doors swung open, and a hush blanketed the courtroom. Everyone rose instinctively as the jurors filed back in, faces unreadable, their steps deliberate. Karen's chest tightened as she searched for a clue, a glance, a tilt of the head, anything that might hint at what they had decided. But there was nothing. Judge Ellison cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman with gray-streaked hair and resolute eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Karen's palms were slick with sweat under the table. Robert Mills leaned in, whispering, "Stay steady. Don't react. No matter what." She nodded faintly, though her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The courtroom was so quiet that every page turn of the clerk's hand sounded like thunder. Finally, the words came. "In the matter of the state versus Lieutenant Karen Dobbs, we, the jury, find the defendant." Time slowed. Karen's breath caught, her eyes fixed on the foreperson's lips. "Guilty of violating civil rights under color of authority." Gasps rippled through the room. A few in the gallery clapped before the judge's gavel struck sharply. "Order!" Karen felt her body jolt, as if the word guilty had physically struck her. She sat frozen, the weight of it pressing her into the chair. Her mind scrambled. How? After years of service? After all I've done? But beneath that protest, another truth gnawed its way up, quieter and far more dangerous, because they saw what I never wanted to see in myself. Robert Mills rose quickly. "Your Honor, we move for immediate appeal." "Denied," Judge Ellison interrupted firmly. "Sentencing will be scheduled. Lieutenant Dobbs will be remanded into custody." Karen's head spun. Custody. The word echoed like a cell door slamming. Across the aisle, Victoria Hayes rested a hand on Terrence Lawson's shoulder. His eyes glistened, a mixture of relief and grief. Marcus Green sat still, jaw set, but his gaze finally lifted to Karen. Not with triumph, not even with hatred, but with something far heavier. Pity. The bailiff approached. Karen stood stiffly, her wrists trembling as the cold bite of handcuffs locked around them. She had cuffed countless suspects in her career. Never had she imagined the sound echoing behind her own back. Reporters scribbled furiously. The gallery erupted in whispers. Cameras flashed. Yet all Karen could hear was her own breath, ragged and shallow, and the echo of the verdict rolling through her chest. As she was led past the jury box, she glanced at them one last time. Their eyes told her what the verdict hadn't spelled out. This wasn't just about one night. This was about every choice she had justified, every complaint she had dismissed, every shadow she had ignored. For the first time, Karen Dobbs wasn't lieutenant, wasn't protector, wasn't the one in control. She was simply a name in the system, another case file stamped with a single word. Guilty. And as the courtroom doors closed behind her, she realized the hardest part wasn't the loss of her badge, or even her freedom. It was the crushing weight of finally seeing herself as the world had seen her all along.